Hey everybody, it's the Kutch again. Black Myth Wukong is a game that I found quite interesting. It was labeled as a Souls-like, and I don't really find that to be an accurate descriptor. So to give you an outline of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to discuss the story, world exploration, combat, technical issues, and then my final thoughts on the game and why it's so successful. Starting with the story, this is an adaptation of an ancient Chinese tale called Journey to the West. My understanding of the story is that it focuses on the journey to India by a Buddhist monk and revolves strongly around Wukong. I'm only lightly familiar with the story myself, namely from watching the movie Journey to the West that came out in 2013. It's an action comedy by Stephen Chow. It's an absolute blast, and I highly recommend seeing it at least once. The developers put a lot of effort into trying to tie mechanics and other world elements of the Journey to the West into this game. We have gourds, pills, staff combat, transformations for Wukong, all things that appear in the story itself. One of the things that I really liked about the way the story was portrayed in this game is that you don't have to be particularly familiar with any element of it to understand what's going on. The game is absolutely rich with lore, and provides it in digestible chunks.
大圣死后，6根中有5根存留下来，被几个妖王分去，唯独羿没了。羿为6根之首，是每个生命独一无二的本质。正因如此，它注定会随着生命的逝去而陨灭。
The game world feels like it exists independently of you being there, and that's something that I think is really fantastic. On the flip side, though, there were a few things that I wasn't quite fond of as far as the story goes. This might be a personal hang-up, but I was annoyed to find traditional Chinese characters being voiced with UK accents.
One day, I was foraging for food and found myself caught in a hunter's trap. A young scholar saved me and kept me in his home to let me heal.
My sack awaits misguided souls like you.
This wicked sack is much more vicious than before, nurturing such evilness. Yellowbrow must have woven Wukong's strength into it. That bastard!
This made sense in the Souls games because they were strongly inspired by medieval Europe, but Wukong does not have that luxury. So I ended up swapping over to the Chinese dialogue with English subtitles. That one change really helped with my immersion, and I actually appreciated these performances quite a bit more. Even though that smoothed a bit of the tension of delivery, there was a certain element of feeling lost in what they were trying to convey.
修炼多日，把守攻城。
狂贼休要得意，在我看破神机，再来与你讨账。别这精疲力尽的，我不是也动了心思。别说了，桌子都买不起，面不手艺。服了吧？
Very simply put, the English adaptation just wasn't very good. I found myself more trying to pick up the gist or the feeling of the moment rather than what was actually being said, and I actually enjoyed that more as I played along. It sort of had its own little charm, but needs improvement at the end of the day. I did see that a recent update purports to fix certain English elements, but I'll have to wait until a new Game Plus cycle to inspect it. The end of each chapter rewards the player with some really nice cutscenes which clock in at about 30 minutes total. They're kind of like little mini episodes that provide more context for the story at large. Whatever team they had working on these cutscenes really outdid themselves. At first the animation style didn't really seem to fit with the overall look of the game, but they immediately grew on me the more I watched and are now what I consider a highlight of the game. Now that I've discussed the story somewhat, I want to talk about world exploration, as it's deceptively intricate and is one of the highlights for me. First and foremost, the art direction is absolutely gorgeous. I had some issues that I'll discuss a little later on in terms of technical difficulties that caused it to not quite be rendered as nicely as it could be, but in general, the art design was able to carry large elements of the visual aspect of this game. Not unlike Dark Souls, this game does not provide you with a map. I think it's a lost art of game design where players are expected to navigate based on their own knowledge and landmark recognition. It's really refreshing to have a contemporary game where the HUD isn't overwhelmed by map markers everywhere telling you where to go and what's there. This is very much a linear design with many branching paths, so there's a lot of geographic space and it's easy to find something new or hidden. I actually really like that we have an action-adventure game that doesn't feel like it's a slave to the open-world trend. Because it's linear, I found that it really worked well with not having a map, and I actually do enjoy that. Just like the Souls games, you can miss a branch, or see it and forget to come back to it. Forks can have their own set of forks that take you down further branches. You can find loot chests with crafting materials, special enemies who, once defeated, can turn into spirit possessions so that you can transform into them throughout combat. Coupled with the branching level design, there are hidden bosses everywhere, which is fantastic. Not all elements of the world design is sunshine and rainbows. The entire pagoda area was just awful. You run around in a giant fucking circle 3 times, then fight the boss at the top. The area is visual white noise, where it all blends together in the worst ways. It was boring both visually and in terms of exploration. Adding lemon juice to the wound, you have that same bullshit mechanic from Dark Souls 3, with the jailers with hot irons that decrease your maximum health pool the longer you're exposed to them. That's basically exactly what happens here in the Pagoda realm. You experience randomly occurring insanity in the zone, causing creatures to appear who reduce your health as you fight them. It was more tedious than interesting, and really served as a low point in the game for me. Something that I didn't quite like as much about world exploration was the ratio of interesting discoveries to boring ones. You don't really find a lot of unique weapons or armor, there aren't any player skins or costumes, and by and large many of the rewards end up being crafting materials. So most of your exploration, other than the gratification of exploring more and seeing pretty things, mostly just yields crafting materials or optional bosses. And that's nice in many ways. What's there is definitely passable. But you know, when I think about games like Darksiders or Dark Souls, where you'll find things that will cause you to want to experiment a bit and play around with your combat style, maybe try something that you weren't necessarily inclined to do at first, but now you have that one piece that's going to push that build over the edge, there definitely could have been better elements of world exploration. Given that we have an announcement for the DLC, something that I'm hoping that they'll bring to the game is, if not a full revamp, at least minor additions to the exploration elements, so that it's a little more rewarding than just getting some crafting materials or a new spirit you'll never use. A game that handled this issue quite well in my opinion was Jedi Fallen Order. That game puts emphasis on swagging out your lightsaber, everything from hilt parts to blade color, and was chock full of cosmetics for the player to collect. Let's talk about combat, and this is where I have the most complaints about the game. Combat is fairly shallow and doesn't amount to a lot more than simple X and Y combos with a couple spells thrown in. Your build, from your gourd to the weapon that you're using to your armor set, oftentimes is designed to amplify whatever spell you're going to use. Your gourd has several items that can be placed in it to help tailor elements of your build. You can swap these out on the fly so long as you're not in combat. One of Wukong's combat options is to transform into one of several select bosses you've defeated. Different transformations have their own specialized movesets, and there are certain bosses where a certain move might be useful. It really reminded me of War's Chaos form in Darksiders 1. In both Darksiders, the transformation is big, slow, but does fuckloads of damage. In this particular case, even when building around a transformation, I didn't feel like the upgrade was very impactful. I did have a few instances where I tried to build around transformation specifically, and I just wasn't feeling the gains that would make it worth dedicating a build to long term. The best use I've found in it though is that it's a pretty decent get out of jail free card, because whatever damage you take while you're transformed doesn't translate to your base health. Despite the added utility, I didn't really find myself utilizing those transformations very often. You do have the ability to devise different builds, but the options feel fairly limited and not particularly novel. The playstyle options and practical choices left to you as a player, at least in my case, left a lot to be desired from the game. While I was playing this, I was really thinking primarily of how much I loved Darksiders 2. Darksiders 2 is an action-adventure game where you can build around almost any stat. You can build around physical crit, spell crit, life leech, execute chance, and so on. Combined with these options, your main weapon, scythes, provide fast-paced and agile combo-based combat like Wukong, but the player can then choose a secondary weapon for which there are several types with their own movesets to add further layers of complexity. In theory, Wukong follows this paradigm but shifts it slightly to focus more to building around specific abilities. I honestly just found a lot of the choices boring or unimpactful. As I think on it, a lot of the set bonuses behaved more like rings in Dark Souls than bona fide set bonuses. Take the Serpent Scale set, for example. It provides greatly reduced stamina and water. It can be a useful effect, but is it worth dedicating 3 armor pieces to? Or the Gale Guard set. The 2 bonuses it provides are to grant additional focus upon perfect dodges and slightly reduces cooldown for spells on perfect dodge. In essence, play the game exactly the same way I have been, with virtually no change to playstyle. Not only is the set bonus conditional, but my experience with the fights was that almost none of them last long enough for my spells to be used more than once anyway. This isn't to say every set is lame, there are a couple of standouts. The Yaksha Outrage set not only looks fantastic, but provides the player with additional damage to Pillar Stance varied combos, Sweeping and Churning Gale, and increases overall damage to both dealt and taken. Not only does it encourage a high-risk, high-reward playstyle, but it also rewards the player with a unique animation during these attacks. The Centipede set encourages the player to self-poison as it provides reduced poison damage over time and significantly increases attack while the player is poisoned. These are examples of sets that at least add a little flavor to the gameplay, but overall the gear pool felt like it was half-finished. Of course, each set benefits from you redistributing your stats in Celestial Medicine accordingly. I will say in fairness that there are certain bosses where certain abilities will or will not be effective, which I do think incentivizes the player to play around with the options at your disposal a bit, though I would consider the list of such bosses quite short. Trying to upgrade multiple sets is an issue, namely due to finite upgrade resources that cannot be refunded once spent, and there are certain sets that you have to do multiple playthroughs to max out, which is really unfortunate. When you try to use a spell and you get attacked, if you're attacked before that spell successfully triggers, you will not take a mana penalty, which is to say you're not charged the cost of the spell, but you are charged the full cooldown time of that spell, which is absolutely ridiculous. There were a number of times where I tried to use a spell on an enemy, my spell got cancelled, and that spell was put on full cooldown. That really screwed me over because, as I mentioned, this game really focuses on you building around your spells more than anything. So if right out the gate your spell is cancelled and you've got to wait through the entire cooldown, you're just standing around with your cock in your ass because all of your resources went into one build that you can now not use. On the note of spells, Pluck of Money is just busted strong. I found myself utilizing the spell more than any other one for giant chunks of the game. Now that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that the spell itself was too strong, so much as the other spells just didn't feel strong enough. Being able to freeze your opponent, for example, might have some utility and definitely may manifest its utility at different times, but it's definitely not going to be as immediately impactful as a good Pluck of Many. You can address this by recrafting large portions of your build at any point free of charge. That being said, though, it feels like you're getting stopped dead in your tracks sometimes, which is really frustrating. I think having more build variety and more interesting combos would really help with that. That being said, given that all combat revolves around you using only staff and spells, there's only so much variety that could be had regardless. The last couple bosses are ball-bustingly difficult to the point of being comical. The difficulty shift was jarring and felt like a completely different game. If there was an expectation placed early on, it wouldn't be an issue. Like if the game difficulty had ramped up more consistently from a mechanic perspective, or if the game dialogue said something to the effect of, your final fight will be the most difficult challenge that you've ever faced, for example. I'm a big fan of Souls-likes. I like playing games where there's a little more to it than just mashing X and then occasionally Y. But the big problem here is the disparity between the expectation that I had for literally almost the entire game up until those two bosses. I went from dropping bosses in 1 to 2 attempts to literally spending about 1 to 2 hours learning the movesets for both the secret boss, Erlang, and the final boss, Great Sage's Broken Shell. The fight with Erlang specifically is quite a spectacle, and I really enjoyed beating him, but that didn't change the fact that he felt more like a Souls boss stuck in God of War. Focusing on Great Sage's Broken Shell, I'm not really fond of games where players fight themselves as a boss. I really didn't care for it in Darksiders where you have to fight your war clone. I really didn't care for it in Elden Ring when you have to fight the Mimic Tier clone version of yourself. I didn't like it in Thymesia where you're the final boss. There's something about slapping a twirled mustache on the character model and calling it a boss that really rustles my jimmies. It's one of those things where it's just not interesting to me and generally feels lazy. Now to discuss technical issues. There are bugs everywhere in this game. I've experienced the game randomly crashing, constant minor frame drops, unreal assets not loading, and lighting engine issues. There are bugs that can even impair questing and finding bosses. There's a purple pillar quest that I was trying to do, for example, where you need to find 3 pillars to unlock a 4th with a unique boss. I found all 3 pillars and then couldn't unlock the 4th. To my knowledge, there's nothing to do about it but wait for a patch. I'm running an i9-13900K 2080 Ti based system and found I was having major frame rate and rendering issues when I first started playing. After a lot of trial and error, I ultimately discovered global illumination to be the culprit, and setting it to the lowest value fixed the bulk of my issues. Despite the solution, many areas in the game suffered significant lighting and contrast problems where the brights were way too bright and the darks were way too dark. This was especially bad in the desert areas. I'm sure many of these issues will be hammered out in time, but the lighting issue especially made large portions of the game difficult to appreciate. Something I also noticed while playing is that the game seemed to inconsistently render random things at any given time, or loaded them with pixelated quality. This was especially bad on the Nimbus, which never looked any better regardless of how high or low I cranked my settings. The game is well grounded in myth and legend that's simply foreign to a lot of Westerners. It stays focused on its source material and tries to convey adventure and redemption. It's not trying to make a socio-political statement or reflect on the opinions of the developers, as has been the trend with many Western AAA games of late. Its solitary goal is to be a serviceable video game adaptation of Journey to the West. It provides minor to moderate challenge. It gratifies player exploration and discovery with beautiful world design and hidden bosses, and tells a unique tale wholly unfamiliar to most Western gamers. Beyond that, though, it's just a fun game. I would describe the game as exceedingly adequate. Sometimes that's all I want, and this one certainly delivers.